was one of the first doctors sent by the company to investigate reports of issues with vaccines we designed. None of us thought it was anything to be worried about at first. It wasn't like everyone who received the vaccine had dropped dead, though in hindsight, that might have been preferable to what actually happened. At the time, we just knew that a bunch of people who received our vaccine, mainly the very old or very young, were suffering from uncomfortable symptoms following their vaccinations. However, one look at the company report of the incident made me uneasy. The wording was left intentionally vague, but the language used suggested whatever was plaguing them went far beyond the usual migraines or fever. My best guess is the public relations team didn't want the exact details of the side effects to be written down on a publicly available document, so they decided to be selective in their wording instead. Even then, I knew that the symptoms had to be either severe or downright deadly if they were willing to go that far to suppress information on it. We did have to rush the vaccine quite a bit, so a few complications were to be expected. A lot of us on the research team actually did try to warn the higher-ups, and Dr. Matthews in particular, that certain people like the elderly and those suffering from personal illnesses may not be suitable for the vaccine at its current stage. To absolutely no one's surprise, none of them listened. Although the entire research team knew that the company's backing made us legally untouchable, we were still nervous about having to confront our enforced negligence firsthand. Regardless of what anybody said, if anybody died from the vaccine we produced, the blood would be on our hands. All we could do was hope that whatever unpleasant side effects they were suffering from were curable with our current resources. Any hope of that was snuffed out when we arrived at the facility where the victims of our company's greed were being quarantined. We arrived at the company-owned lab and had to go through half a dozen health checks before getting thoroughly disinfected again for good measure. Then we were put into airtight hazmat suits, disinfected again while inside the suit, and finally allowed to enter the quarantine room for the first patient. According to one of the doctors stationed there to take care of them before our arrival, he was one of the less severe cases. The harrowed look in that doctor's eyes spoke more on the magnitude of our failures than any company report could. I didn't want to know what could have possibly happened to the victims to elicit that kind of reaction on an experienced doctor, but I didn't have a choice. As far as the company was concerned, the research team had caused this, and it was up to us to fix it. I only wish Dr. Matthews was there too, so he could see the result of his reckless plan. The patient was laid down on a medical bed hooked up to multiple monitors and IV tubes. Bandages covered his body, but I could see purple rashes peeking out around the edges. His eyes were open, but they stared blankly at the ceiling and didn't move to look at us when we entered. According to the monitor, his heartbeats were far too slow and occurred at odd, irregular intervals. I could tell that he was having trouble breathing too, yet he seemed completely calm from what little I could see on his face. I'd never seen anything like it. Some of the chemicals listed on the IV bags were for company medicine that I knew for a fact wasn't even being out on the market yet. I couldn't imagine how bad it must be for them to be busting out experimental drugs like that. I wasn't sure what the others and I would be able to do in the face of something like this, but I guess the company was getting desperate for a solution and weren't above scraping the bottom of the barrel. This sort of scandal would not only be the death of the company, but also put everyone from the research team who made the vaccine to the management who approved of its distribution in jail for a very, very long time. After working in that company for years, there was no doubt in my mind that they would rather let those people die and their bodies disposed of without a trace than take responsibility for what they've done. At best, they might try to pay the friends and family of the victims off to keep quiet. At worst, they wouldn't be above silencing any healthy person who threatened to sue them for the death of a family member. The rest of the patients being housed in that facility were more or less the same strange purple rashes, irregular heartbeats, and blank stares. More severe cases had the rash engulfing their entire body and causing excessive hair loss. The glazed over eyes changed in color as well, turning permanently black in the corneas and presumably becoming blind. Brain scans reveal that while most of the patients with less severe cases are still conscious and merely unable to act on their thoughts, those who were in the latter stages of the condition caused by our vaccine were completely unconscious. Their brain activity read the same as that of someone in deep sleep. Some scans suggested that the affected person was in a dreamless slumber. Most of them read as if whatever was going on inside their heads was the worst nightmare they could ever imagine. I can't imagine what that must have been like for them, trapped inside a nightmare that they'd never wake up from. The doctors who had been tending to the patient before us more or less disappeared when we arrived. I couldn't blame them. We did our best to help them, pump them with as many painkillers as humanly possible to ease their suffering. But being surrounded by the product of your sins every single day takes a toll on you mentally. The massive workload, coupled with the knowledge that all of it was indisputably our fault, slowly wore down our spirits. The 8 of us decided to have an under-the-table meeting at a little cafe far away from the watchful eyes of our company. We were trying to decide whether or not to stage a rebellion for the sake of our own conscience. The patients were in pain because of us. That was beyond question. And yet, they were intentionally prolonging their suffering just for a chance to save our own reputation. It just wasn't right. We discussed whether or not we should euthanize the patients and come forward with the company's malpractice together. 2 of us had to stay back at the facility to look after the patients, but they casted their votes beforehand. Both were in favor of deciding to euthanize the patients and turn ourselves in for our involvement. Their decision was echoed by everyone else at the cafe. But just as we were about to come to a unanimous decision, we received text from one of the doctors we left at the research facility. 4 simple words with no further context. Burn it all down. Seconds later, he sent us something else. A photo taken in the lab we'd just been in not an hour ago. I scrolled down my phone to view the picture and immediately screamed.